Where did the religious nuttery come from? Well, this is just an incredible story. I saw this over the weekend on Twitter, and then saw a piece that was published in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune about it. And in fact, I quote both of them in my op-ed over at HeartMailReport.com that is titled, "Where Did the Religious Nuttery Come From?" Jess and John Pence, P-E-N-T-Z, were, it's a married couple. They've been married 17 years. They were traveling from Minneapolis, where they live, to Wisconsin for the 4th of July weekend. This was July 3rd. And they pulled into the Hayward, Wisconsin Walgreens pharmacy. And because Jess had realized that she had forgotten to bring her birth control pills. And they were going to be gone for a little bit. So they pulled into the pharmacy, and she went over to the shelf and picked up a box of condoms and took it to the counter and set it down and pulled out her credit card. And the clerk said, ain't going to ring that up for you, or words to that effect. In fact, the quote from the piece in the Star-Tribune is, "We can sell that to you," but he said with a smirk, according to the guy standing in line behind Jess, who didn't know her, but talked with the reporter. "We can sell that to you, but I won't because of my faith. Not going to sell you any condoms today." There's no law in America against behaving like an ass. So this Walgreens clerk was entirely within his rights to behave like one. But because of 5 Republicans on the U.S. Supreme Court, well, 6 now, it is now problematic and soon could be against the law nationwide if Clarence Thomas gets his way, for Walgreens to fire this guy, John was his name, the clerk, for exercising his faith when working in a drugstore. Now, the vast majority of Americans don't share this opinion. Jennifer Brooks wrote the piece for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, and she noted, quote, "When the Pew Research Center surveyed American attitudes about birth control, just 4% viewed contraception as morally wrong. Condoms protect us from disease and prevent unwanted pregnancy. What's not to like?" End quote. I would add, by the way, the history of condoms goes back literally thousands of years. They used to make them out of sheep intestines, like thousands of years ago. But what's so astonishing about this is that we have not reached this point in America, the overturning of Roe, the subjugation of women, as it were. We haven't reached this point in American religious nuttery because the religious right rose up and took over America. The religious right is still a fringe movement in America. Instead, we have reached this point because a group of right-wing billionaires didn't want to pay their taxes. They wanted their taxes cut. They didn't want their refineries and other polluting businesses to be regulated because that was hurting their profits. And they didn't want to have to employ unionized workforces. So in 1971, when Lewis Powell laid out his doctrine of war against America, it was called the Powell Memo. This was a year before Richard Nixon put him on the U.S. Supreme Court. Most Americans were just fine with how things were going. I mean, generally speaking, the top tax rate was 74%. The top corporate tax rate was 50%. Unions were, over a third of us were unionized. Guns manufacturers were regulated, as were refineries. So these right-wing billionaires and their corporations and foundations came up with a very straightforward strategy. Number one, convince Americans that taxes are not what we always understood them to be, as I believe it was Louis Brandeis who called them the cost of civil society, but instead that they were a burden, that working-class Americans are unfairly bearing. And once those Republicans got elected on a tax cut platform, they would massively cut the taxes of the morbidly rich and throw a little bone to the average working guy. Oh, yeah, you get $10. Number two, convince Americans that regulations that protect consumers and the environment are also burdens from an out-of-control nanny state, even though such regulations actually save lives and benefit Americans far more than they cost. And number three, convince Americans that unions aren't democracy in the workplace that protect workers' rights, but instead are some kind of elaborate scam to raid workers' paychecks to the benefit of corrupt union bosses. To pull all this off, they spent 5 decades and billions of dollars subsidizing think tanks and policy groups at both the state and federal level. There's now an extensive network of them all across the country, ALEC and all these other things. But that still wasn't enough to get them the political power that they needed. It was hit and miss. Sometimes Republicans won the presidency, sometimes they lost, sometimes they held Congress, sometimes they didn't. They needed more. They sponsored right-wing talk radio to the tune of millions of dollars a year. Just Limbaugh and Hannity's shows alone got $1 million a year each from the Heritage Foundation. And Australian billionaire Rupert Murdoch rolled out Fox News to complement the propaganda campaign. Later would come the social media, bots and trolls, along with thousands of new websites pretending to be local newspapers. And still that wasn't enough to get them the power they needed. They hooked up with the NRA, which helped sponsor the Reagan Revolution and was richly rewarded with a law that makes it illegal for the federal government to compile death statistics from gun violence, and gave their industry immunity from prosecution for the damage that their products cause, product liability prosecution. The only industry outside of nuclear power in America that has this immunity. And they finally got Americans to go along with the plan, but only when they added their own religious secret sauce. And that secret sauce was Jerry Falwell and his buddies. Jerry Falwell had jumped into the religious grift back in the 60s after in the late 60s, I believe it was, after the Brown v. Board case, you know, with the basically all-white academies and things. And, I mean, not just him, there was a whole bunch of them. And he was an inveterate grifter. He was hustling Jesus. He built a multi-million-dollar empire, ignoring Jesus' teachings about humility and poverty and the need to care for others, and instead promoting this new muscular Jesus, a Jesus who endorsed assault weapons and private jets for preachers. And this Jesus wanted you to get rich. They called it the prosperity gospel. Riches, they said, are a sign of God's blessing. Yeah. And, you know, suddenly we had mega churches and TV pastors and Pat Robertson and Jim Baker and Tammy Faye and the whole bunch of them. And they became not only multimillionaires, but they also openly defied IRS regulations and preached politics in the pulpit. And millions of mostly non-political churchgoers were suddenly not just evangelists for Jesus, but now evangelists for the Republican Party. And to keep the rubes coming, Republicans on the Supreme Court had to throw them the occasional bone, you know, saying that, oh yeah, cake bakers can refuse to do cakes for weddings for gay couples and things like that. Churches kept getting richer, Republicans kept getting elected. And now we're at the point where half the population is in their crosshairs. That would be the women of America. It's no longer just a matter of that $50 trillion transfer of wealth from middle America to the top 1% through changes in the tax law, or a few 100,000 children downstream of coal mines getting permanent neurological damage because Donald Trump's, his first major piece of legislation, or his first policy signature was making it legal to dump more coal waste in rivers, or workers thinking that they get better wages and benefits if they had a union. No, literally none of those issues, mass shootings, medical bankruptcy, student debt, homelessness. Louise and I were talking about this as we were driving around this weekend, you know, looking at the homeless camps and things. And literally, before Reagan was elected president in 1980, literally, you never saw homeless people in America. We can get into that another time, all the details of why, but basically Republican policies brought us homelessness. And now they're coming for your birth control. Will enough Americans finally wake up to this 40-year grift to put an end to it and return our country to sanity? We'll find out this November.